Welcome, everyone. And I am just delighted today we have Hannah Zeavin with us to introduce her and to have her as our guest. I think it's going to be a really exciting talk, and thank you so much for joining us. So Zeavin, just by way of introduction, Zeavin is a lecturer in the departments of English and History at the University of California, Berkeley, and is a faculty affiliate of the University of California at Berkeley Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, and on the Berkeley Center for New Media's Executive Committee. Additionally, she's a visiting fellow at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Difference. Zeavin's first book, The Distance Cure, which we are delighted to hear more about today, second half of the title, A History of Teletherapy, was published by MIT Press in 2021. And she's currently at work on her second book, Mother's Little Helpers, Technology in the American Family, also from MIT Press, coming out remarkably shortly. No, not okay. Well, anyway, coming out as soon as things happen. So that's really exciting. Zeavin serves as an editorial associate for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association and is co-founder of the STS Futures Initiative. She has other work that has appeared or is forthcoming in American Imago, Differences, a Journal of Feminist Cultural Studies, Los Angeles Review of Books, and in some other places. She received her BA from Yale and her PhD from the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU in 2018. And I just wanted to say, on behalf of Northeastern, we're delighted to have you. We're especially delighted because we've been thinking more and more here at Northeastern about the digital aspects of health and healthcare, and so and how healthcare technologies are really central to understanding the future of healthcare. So your talk is perfect for things that we've been thinking a lot about. And just for those of you who are in the audience, the way that we're going to work the question and answer section, which should be about 45 minutes or at the end of this, or maybe slightly less, will just be through the chat function, since we're not using a formal Zoom webinar. So either you can just type RTS, which means request to speak, or if you have a question that you prefer to type, you can type it out, and I'm happy to read it. But without further ado, thank you so much for joining us all the way from California. We wish in person maybe someday, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me, and to everyone at the Northeastern Humanities Center and the Health and Humanities and Society group at Northeastern. It's really an honor to be here and to see some people I know in the room. I'm just going to go ahead and share my slide. So forgive me for 1 second. Okay. So yes, I'm Hannah Zeavin, and I'm going to be speaking today a little bit about my first book, which is called The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, which is in essence about exactly what we're doing right now, but in the service of therapy. And in this talk, I'm going to be drawing on a set of case studies from this book. The book takes under consideration one relationship between therapists, broadly defined, and patients. The Distance Cure makes several other interventions via examining the therapist and their patient working at distance from one another. So globally, the book seeks to retell the history of clinical psychology via its shadow form, teletherapy. Instead of this being a recent concern in our age of pandemic, as well as quote unquote big tech, I argue that teletherapy as well as telemedicine have been about to make their grand debut for about 100 years or more. Teletherapy is as old as psychoanalysis itself. In fact, I argue that telepsychoanalysis predates psychoanalysis in the room. Then the book takes this extraordinary and vulnerable and intimate relationship, which is the focus of the book, between therapist and patient, and it recasts that relationship not as a dyad, which is how we've historically thought of it, but as a triad, always involving communication technology. I argue that ever since Freud stopped laying hands on his patients as part of hypnosis, which was a good idea, some intervening distance has always been present between patient and therapist. And then I looked at how therapists and their patients have bridged that distance in order for productive therapeutic communication to happen. Mediated, networked, and teletherapeutic relationships physically literalize the separation inherent in all therapies, even as they work to diminish it. And as I conducted my research in order to make this critical history of teletherapy across the 20th and 21st centuries, it turns out that teletherapy almost always attends crisis. Whether that's the crisis of World War II in the UK, the war for liberation in Algeria, a suicide epidemic in San Francisco, and of course, our current pandemic unfolding right now. While these cases are quite different from one another, I unite them by making the claim that distance isn't the opposite of presence, absence is. So if tele isn't an absence, what is it? The book elaborates various forms of what I call distanced intimacy, various genres of relating that are fostered by remote communication, one of which I'm going to speak about today and focus on, which is auto-intimacy. So perhaps because algorithmic care is so very much on many of our minds, constantly in the news, both its pitfalls and supposed successes, I thought today I might speak with you all about the driving concerns of AI therapy and how we arrived at our present moment of increasingly pervasive presence of algorithmic, machine learning, AI, and virtual humans in mental health care. So to do so, I'm going to trace how we got from a tape recorder as therapy to the most sophisticated attempts at automating and scripting therapeutic interaction. I'm going to first provide some background for how I think about algorithmic therapies, and then I'll take us through the history and culture of algorithmic care in the 60s and 70s, analyze models of mind at mid-century that emerged and were very friendly to computational models, and look at the phenomenon of algorithmic care in our present. And I'll conclude with some very brief thoughts about how this history can help us at the level of policy decisions about who should receive this kind of care and when. So more on the sort of pitfalls rather than the promises side. So auto-intimacy. In the most cutting edge contemporary efforts to build algorithmic models for mental health care, and in the very earliest moments of work related to automated therapies, the dream has remained the same: to build a functional, universalizable program that simulates therapy. Whether these attempts fail and succeed, and they most frequently fail, this type of mental health treatment codes expertise into a program and codes out the overt acting human expert. It is the movement from a simulation of an interpersonal relationship in service of psychological care and growth to an intrapersonal, self-sufficient regimen. In this, these therapist stand-ins remove one term from the triad of patient, therapist, and technology that's so central to my book by combining two: the technology and the expert, leaving just the technology and the patient alone with themselves. And that contraction of just a device and a user, or just a script and a patient, would, the argument goes, allow us to crucially batch process patients and patients in waiting, especially when large groups of people need therapeutic treatment suddenly and also all at once. And as I said in my brief opening remarks, teletherapy almost always is innovated during, adopted in, and generally attends crisis and other forms of crisis communication. This is a humanistic and ethical impulse, a reason to deploy these treatments. And frequently, this is the argument made in favor of them. Our current moment is no exception. The dream of automated therapy is a democratizing one, and we, not just in the United States, but worldwide, are in dire need of mental health care. The WHO stated in the years before the COVID-19 pandemic that we were already in a pandemic of anxiety and depression worldwide. Algorithmic care then might be one way forward, precisely because one doesn't have to create an army of therapists, and automated therapies are relatively cheap and rely on both individuals and their habitual media as delivery mechanism. The psychiatrist Isaac Marks argues that, quote, refining care delivery to the point where self-care becomes possible is often the product of the most sophisticated stage of science, end quote. And here Marx describes the end stage of care delivery as self-care rather than care itself. Self-care is the ultimate form of on-demand access, meeting the patient not only where and when they are, but as their mediated selves. Autonomy is the aim of care and of automation. Automation is the dream of autonomy on this understanding. And in the pandemic, almost every single form of teletherapy has exploded, continues to explode, gaining new users and patients exponentially. If previously teletherapy was therapy's shadow form, now most therapy is teletherapy. In order to reach as many patients as possible, many have turned to mental health care apps, whether funded by the government or Silicon Valley or adjacent startups, to provide this essential service. But these apps aren't just a neutral good. They do not simply fulfill this democratizing promise. The reality is, of course, much more complicated. Algorithmic care can quickly become dispatched, even when it provides either a very narrow form of care, like only addresses anxiety but not depression, is unusable for a variety of reasons by many, whether because of digital redlining or language barriers, or it can become a pernicious backdoor for surveillance and disrupt ethical standards important to the therapeutic scenario. Or, as happens frequently, it will be a mix of these concerns all at once. And sometimes algorithmic care is derided as, or scientifically proven to be, lesser, depending on what it's being compared to in the first place, which then can slow or altogether prevent patients from seeking other forms of care that might better work for them. So how does this automated autonomy function? And what is it doing to our patients that we now suddenly call users? Well, a machine listens and a digital interface provides the therapeutic setting and experience. The only explicit human involved in these one-to-one interactions is the doctorless patient. In algorithmic therapies, which produce a closed circuit of self, automation takes on the role of a computational other. And I call what happens in this circuit auto-intimacy. The auto here is doing double work. It's the auto of the self and the auto of automation. The two combine. I take auto-intimacy to be a state in which one is required to address oneself through the medium of a non-human, both the piece of hardware and the code that it's running, with the aim of self-knowing and extending the capacity of self, much like one may come to know oneself better by writing in a diary or tracking oneself or so on. Unlike human therapists who ostensibly provide more than just an embodied receptacle and place of storage for the speech of their patients, if they provide that anyway, automated and or algorithmic based therapies listen or read solely in order to respond. They can't help themselves. They listen via a variety of mechanisms, including retrieval-based decision trees, automatic scripts, and also paralinguistic vocal monitoring, listening to biomarkers in the voice, supposedly. They are rather inflexible and always rule-bound. Yet at the same time, algorithmic therapies also rely on a most intimate computing, in which a rich set of relationships is present between the user and the therapeutic apparatus, or I argue they rely on auto-intimacy. In the case of computer-based therapies, it's specifically a therapeutic relationship to the self, not to an other, that is mediated by the program and its process. Historically, auto-intimacy in the service of therapy has been driven by these very desires to automate treatment and then increase consistent engagement with that treatment via pleasure, enjoyment, and gamification. And these two entwined impulses have complicated implications: the impulse to democratize and the impulse to capture the patient. So taken together, automated therapies do raise new particular concerns about their technology, the types of therapeutic models they harness, and the modes of relationality that they construct, who is included, who is excluded from their use, and what the ramifications might be of putting the burden of care onto the person who needs to receive care in the first place. And we might ask, what are the foreseeable byproducts, if not overt intentions, of these programs that can slip from care to control? But it turns out that though many of these consumer technologies are quite new, there's a surprisingly long history to these questions and tensions, and a culture of automated therapies born out of the very first attempts to simulate a therapist that inflect our work on this pressing question today. And it all started with a tape recorder. So I, of course, love that many of you at least are in the sort of Boston and Cambridge area. That's where our tape recorder experiment takes place. So during that wild psychedelic era of Timothy Leary and friends in the late 1950s, Dr. Charles Slack, a psychologist working at the Harvard Psychology Department, set about to make one of the earliest experiments with a self-managed, technologized therapy. Slack designed an experiment to test the benefits of soliloquy, or talking out loud to oneself in the presence of no one else. So first, Slack fabricated these tape recorders on the screen that produced a series of clicks in response to sound stimulus, while keeping track of how many clicks the recorders made in response to those inputs. So I would be doing a very good job at this experiment right now. The more you talk, the higher your tally goes. Slack gave these to quote unquote teenage gang members from Cambridge and paid them to be his experimental subjects. So the subjects were asked to speak into the tape recorder without any human witness. And as they spoke, they would see the tally of their clicks growing. And when they stopped talking, the tally stopped increasing. The subjects were paid according to how high their tally went. So the more you talked, the more money you made from the experiment. The automated ticker and that scaled payment were enough stimulus and response to make the subjects have a conversation with themselves, no matter how ridiculous they felt. And the outcome was twofold. One, the subjects produced these very wild recordings that make sort of sound like one side of an interview where the interlocutor is cut out. But moreover, quote, some of the participants said they felt better for having talked this way, end quote. And that was the surprising finding. So Dr. Charles Slack had incidentally built a speech-based self-soothing device that made use of human-machine interaction, just not the kind we think of in our contemporary moment. And of course, the influence of cash. Soliloquy before a non-human other was not a therapy per se, but it had a therapeutic effect. It was a palliative function that was won via the gamification of speech. And some 7 years later, just across Cambridge at MIT, Joseph Weizenbaum would debut his 1966 program, ELIZA, which took this idea of mechanized soliloquy to a whole new level. So ELIZA is one of the most written about therapeutic artifacts, even though she, or it, was not designed to perform and arguably did not provide therapy. So if you've heard the ELIZA story, please bear with me. The ELIZA experiment was intended to demonstrate that, quote, communication between man and machine was superficial. That was it. So to achieve his aim, Weizenbaum made a kind of mistake. He decided to program this program, ELIZA, to quote unquote parody a client-centered therapist doing a preliminary intake with a client. And if you've ever been to therapy, you know, it is not actually the case that a therapist will take down your family history in some kind of routinized way, but that was what Weizenbaum was imagining. And anyway, the kind of therapist he tried to mimic was one who asks empathetic and unconditionally positive questions of the patient. And one way this is achieved is by joining with the patient. So the client will say something and the patient will say back, the patient will say something and the therapist will sort of just rephrase it. So stereotypically, if a patient were to say, I hate my sister, and I don't have a sister, so that's my example. I hate my sister. The therapist might respond, you hate your sister, in a kind of loving tone. Or can you elaborate on hating your sister? So that's what Eliza was programmed to do, just that, reframe any content supplied her via interrogatives. And that kind of lexical entrainment, which is a hallmark now, originates with this experiment. So for Weizenbaum, it didn't really matter. His work wasn't about mimicking a therapist because he wanted to make a therapist bot. He just wanted to conduct his natural language processing experiment. And we can see here Weizenbaum talking with Eliza on the screen. Users were put into conversation with her in what it was called teletype in English, not in code. And the program would respond using a template, which resulted in a real-time transcript, much like now we might chat or DM. And the human and machine were put into a kind of equivalence this way. But then in demonstrating Eliza, Weizenbaum was shocked, quite famously, by a number of non-superficial responses, undermining his whole experiment. He was so upset about it that he was compelled to call them, quote unquote, misinterpretations, which then spurred him, perhaps out of spite, to write his magnum opus, Computer Power and Human Reason. So while Weizenbaum had hoped to demonstrate that this communication between man and machine was superficial, users really liked Eliza. They enjoyed speaking with her. And precisely because Eliza responded predominantly in those interrogatives, she would elicit speech while withholding information about herself. This is both because she has no self and thus nothing to share, and because of the limits of coding in her moment. In this inevitable reticence, she simulates, perhaps even exaggerates, the clinician side of the therapeutic relationship. What better way to control the therapeutic boundary than to remove the therapist from therapy? So Weizenbaum again had this overwhelming experience that in fact, the user turned themselves into Eliza's patient and then used her in a very particular way. They used her as a site of self-talk and also self-pleasure, a site of auto-intimacy, as I'm calling it. And here, the user anthropomorphized media object, Eliza, hosts this kind of notable self-therapeutic activity. And unlike the experience of traditional therapy, this auto-intimate work is not actually experienced as work, and that's crucial. So if you've been in therapy, you might know that it's not always fun, or it maybe is never fun, and maybe you don't want to go, but it's crucial, or it's important, or it's helping. Here it was play. It was experienced as pleasure, and everyone reported enjoying it, and people wanted to do it again. And part of that was, of course, that this was a kind of novel interaction with a computer in this moment, but part of it was that there was an emotional release that people wanted to bring on by talking again. And Eliza was a very early chatbot, one of the very first, and one of the first programs understood to be ready to pass the Turing test. So put another way, as long as we've had chatbots, we've been trying, both accidentally and specifically, to automate therapy. And automating therapy is a litmus test for various kinds of human-computer interaction success and failure. So if Weizenbaum was shocked that anyone actually wanted to talk with Eliza, he had a second surprise in store, one that's crucial to me, which is, quote, a number of practicing psychiatrists believed that the Eliza computer program could grow into a nearly completely automatic form of psychotherapy. Weizenbaum was not a mental health care professional, and he actually had the signal attitude of many in that field, which is that, of course, a human is required to help humans. Computers can't help humans. But if we think about this sort of moment in 1966, much is shifting in Weizenbaum's moment. And he's also in the same sort of speech, and later in this book, he's subtweeting someone specifically, which is Kenneth Colby. So Kenneth Colby is, so it's nice. Kenneth Colby was in the Bay Area where I am. Weizenbaum was in Boston, where you all are. So Kenneth Colby was a psychiatrist and a former psychoanalyst, and he had just started working at Stanford's Department of Computer Science. And Colby had started his work to bring psychoanalysis towards science. And when that didn't work, which it didn't, he started to work on questions of artificial intelligence and mental health. And so at Stanford, Colby pioneered his own chatbot, Shrink, which he sought to, again, batch process patients using a completely automated psychotherapy. This is in this crucial moment in US mental health history when the sort of asylum to community moment is completed. So there's been a deinstitutionalization of mental health care, but the funding never came through for the community part. So there's a huge patchwork non-system of mental health care. There are all of these patients. No one knows what to do with them. Kenneth Colby's answer is, let's get a bunch of automated shrinks, quite literally. So he sets up his experiment at Stanford, and then there's a problem, which is that no one likes it. No one wants to talk with Shrink, like everyone wanted to talk with Eliza. It turns out that auto-intimate pleasure and capture of patients was important. And because people didn't enjoy Shrink, despite its novelty, same period, it failed to produce any explicitly psychotherapeutic interaction that Colby had wanted to foster. So even as Eliza and Shrink are nearly identical under the hood, so to speak, in terms of code, the environments in which each program was tested differed greatly. So Eliza, as Elizabeth Wilson has shown, was tested on MIT's famous network time-sharing computer system, which fostered a kind of creativity. And Shrink was available in a single laboratory, isolated and alone, like going to the medical office. And Colby had made an additional grievous, if not superficial, mistake, which is that he erred in naming his program after a job function and its derogatory, casualizing name, one that undermined even that expert authority. Rather than lending it a proper name that would also gender the script, and the feminization of psychotherapy is deeply underway in this moment, if not complete. So for a new user, Shrink was just a medical software rather than the perfect non-human posing as a human listener. And it might also be worth noting that Eliza is a therapist, whereas Shrink was an MD. So the intent of the programs, their environments, and what kind of expertise they claim to represent all impacted their use. And then perhaps because Colby failed to produce this automated psychotherapist that would actually treat patients, he flipped the script and he began to work on automating computer program patients to be put into conversation with human psychiatrists. He figured, well, let's automate education rather than the other way around. And he made this complex, Perry, who's on the screen, which was meant to mimic a paranoid schizophrenic man in an institution. And he gave this chatbot a name, Perry, as well as Frank Smith, an alias, and a personal history. And Perry actually passed the Turing test. Psychiatrists could not tell the difference between Perry and real human paranoid schizophrenic patients using teletype in a ward at Stanford. And eventually, Perry, an interactive version of which was already hosted on ARPANET, the pre-internet, would be put into conversation with Eliza in summer of 1972 by Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, making a computer-to-computer therapy session one of the very first discussions ever held over TCP/IP. And at the end of it, Eliza charged Perry $399.29 for her services, which is extremely expensive. By 2022 standards, that would be $2,500 today. So that. But returning to Weizenbaum's question about what kind of therapy and therapists can be viewed as the, quote, simplest mechanical parody of a single interview technique, and then as having captured anything of the essence of the human encounter, end quote, requires understanding Weizenbaum's credulity to be misplaced. in fact, passé even. The kinds of therapy that were newly being practiced in the 1960s, as Eliza, Schrank, Perry, and other attempts to automate one side or the other of the supposed therapeutic dyad began to emerge, had already come to the foregone conclusion that indeed models of the mind were best thought of as information processors following rules. So in the post-war era and through the 1960s, as I've gestured at, several things are happening that dramatically change the American mental health care landscape, namely the fall from prominence of Freudian and psychoanalytic therapy, the shift being completed from asylum to community, but without backing and structure, and then the rise of two modes of treatment that worked to ameliorate that problem. On the one hand, of course, psychopharmacological drugs skyrocket in their usage in this moment. And secondly, and germane to the questions of autointimacy, the development of Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavioral therapy, hereafter REBT, in 1959, and Aaron T. Beck's cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, in the mid-60s. So in brief, here's Beck and Ellis on the screen. Beck and Ellis, like Colby before them, were also trained as psychoanalysts, and both also decided it was bunk. Their treatments focused on conscious thoughts that were unwelcome and methods for dismissing them, literally reprogramming the patient. Neither Ellis nor Beck were interested in understanding the history of unconscious motives behind those thoughts. They rejected hermeneutics of suspicion. They simply wanted those thoughts to cease and then be replaced by healthier, happier, and more proactive thoughts. Aaron Beck called the negative thoughts, quote unquote, automatic thoughts. Even the suffering human was seen as an automatic function. So if one represents human mental suffering as automatic and automated, then of course one is able to justify and legitimate addressing that automatic suffering with an automated counterscript. So in keeping with the long traditions of self-help and positive thinking that were popular in the US at mid-century, and which I write about elsewhere in my book, and I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, Ellis did not want to create patients who stayed in treatment and worked with a therapist in what he called, quote unquote, morbid long-term relationships. In fact, he wasn't interested in relationships at all. He wanted patients, to help themselves. And Ellis was concerned with creating autonomy, not relationality. Even as he developed a brand new kind of therapy that would come to dominate the American mental health care landscape, Ellis was encouraging autointimacy. From the outset, he decided to substantiate a therapeutic technique that did not require a therapist, and he was doing so consciously. Instead, he created a media empire. As Oliver Berkman notes, Ellis's REBT was ready-made for publishing, and not just self-help books, though he did so, generating 78 volumes in his lifetime, but also REBT worksheets and other kinds of workbooks, as well as trainings. So this fungibility of media for CBT, where the medium is not the message, also included the human therapist. Following in Ellis's footsteps, Beck too wrote more than 15 books and developed scales and inventories, other ways of securing money rather than treating patients or treating them all at once. He started to quantify the self rather than qualify it. And the mental health care expert, as an efficient or desired conduit for mental health care, gave way to the delivery of these new and auto-intimate ways of diagnosing and knowing. So the faster improvement could be measured, the better. And of course, insurance companies love this, corporations love this, and so on, because faster is better, it's more effective. And this also interrelates to the history of evidence standards also in therapy, which have been quite friendly to CBT. So at the same moment that other mental health efforts were devaluing expertise by distributing the role of the expert in many other radical ways. So in the book, I write about the history of crisis hotlines from the 1950s to present, where the expert is removed precisely to help people who are marginalized by therapeutic care. And again, I'm happy to talk about that more. Ellis and Beck instead removed the absolute demand for the human other in possession of expertise through mediation and through automation. And here, I mean, not automation only via mechanical reproduction by computers in the widest sense, but also in terms of print. They also exchange tape recordings from one patient to another, or later when their techniques were programmed to finally be truly automated, delivered via computer. So, unsurprisingly, psychodynamic oriented practitioners and patients were deeply skeptical of computer as therapist, whereas those who worked with these methods that fall under the cognitive behavioral umbrella embraced wholesale digital and automated therapies. And that divide more or less continues to our present day. So, translating CBT to the computer form is eminently feasible because of what CBT describes the mind as being. If you think X and X is disruptive, rewire and recode the thought by thinking Y. The self will listen to its own script of negative thoughts and automate a new response, thinking that thought as its very own. And this process was automated when computer programs were brought in to treat depression, specifically, but also, yes, other disorders, so called, in the late 80s and early 90s. So Kenneth Colby, never one to give up, made a fully functional CBT software in the 1990s called Doctor Software, which he sold as a popular program, Overcoming Depression, and so on. And the computer was understood by him to be on or at the boundary between the user's interior and their exterior and social environment, both animate and inanimate, as Sherry Turkle says. In this, the computer is not alone. The diary also functions this way, as did Charles Slack's soliloquy experiment with the tape recorder. And these are all experiences with auto-intimate media forms or technologies. The personal computer, and perhaps even more so the smartphone, are perfect instruments for auto-intimacy. They demand it. So nearly 60 years after these experiments, and they were continuous, I'm just going to jump ahead to our kind of present moment. But Colby continued his experiments until he died. Warner Slack, the brother of Charles Slack, made huge strides in the area of human-computer interaction in medicine in the 70s and 80s, focusing on making it pleasurable for the patient. But in 2022, we are still without a fully functioning simulation of a therapist that can treat humans, if that aim is psychodynamic care and not the auto-intimacy of CBT. There is no bot that currently rates well in terms of measurements like the therapeutic alliance or the relationship, or how well a patient and therapist can communicate, even if that therapist is a bot, and so on. Nonetheless, research has not slowed on the goal of elaborating an automated mental health care provider to fully care for the many in dire need of mental health support. Some of this experimentation follows from that unintended promise of Eliza and in Colby's earlier footsteps to make a fully automated therapy that simulates a human, gathers valuable data towards diagnosis, and crucially is enjoyable to use. More frequently, as computer-assisted therapy becomes internet delivered and goes mobile, conversation as remediation of therapy has faded out, and new interactive models have come to the fore. These programs continue to refine self-delivered CBT online and on apps for specific conditions almost always. So depression, anxiety, alcoholism. Other softwares used in conjunction automate the self-tracking aspects of a diary such that the self is quantified into interpretable data at duration. And as we, I'll start to flag up some of the concerns. This all can compromise privacy in ways we may already be acquainted with. One's therapeutic data can and has been sold, hacked, and used against oneself in the future when either trying to get a job or purchase health insurance. So I'll just go through a little tour of some of the contemporary examples of these projects. Ellie is one such example of a contemporary therapy project working to perfect that elusive human presenting automated therapist. So Ellie, whose own name is a nod at that first therapist chatbot, Eliza, was generated at USC with funding from the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, and is currently exclusively used with veterans who have returned from Afghanistan and Iraq. Ellie is a diagnostic system combined with an avatar of an ambiguously raced professional woman sitting in a large, quite comfortable looking therapist chair. She seems confident but approachable. When one user says he's from Los Angeles, the one on your screen, Ellie will respond sweetly, "Oh, I'm from LA myself." And that's what she sounds like. Behind this early small talk, Ellie's already performing a deep analysis on her user. She is equipped with sensors and a webcam that will detect, quote unquote, the affect in speech, as well as mark the posture of the patient, all of their gestures. And she's performing a facial expression recognition and sentiment analysis of the user. She's doing also inventory on users' words, which then she will compare to both a control and military database. All of these data taken together provide Ellie with feedback that allow her to estimate the prevalence of, in the case of this user, depression. For instance, those with depression, according to Ellie's creators, will not pronounce their vowels in the same way non-depressed people do because they will move their facial muscles less. So, of course, it's a very ableist and deeply racialized understanding of the face, as many of scholars have talked about, Sharona Pearl and Beth Semmel. But here, if we look at what Ellie is also doing, she's also showcasing what the creators think might be attractive because she's providing complex customization without judgment, which also means that her users never really know how their diagnosis is crafted, is gathered, is datified and quantified. And so there's this also question raised by Ellie of the difference between something like implicit consent and explicit consent when encountering one of these automated therapies. A different version of a platform that is making use of an avatar, a non-human in this case, is Google's WISA. WISA boasts 2 million users and has conducted over 100 million conversations. And it just this past summer got another 100 million in B series funding. And this service bills itself as a companion, quite crucially, a mental health friend. And it takes as its avatar this adorable penguin. So the whole point here is, of course, to induce the user to talk to the penguin, say much more that they would say to the penguin than to a human. And of course, while skirting a number of the markers of oversight by not claiming to be a therapy. So a mental health friend is very different than claiming therapeutic efficacy. And there are over 10,000 apps that do things like this in the iTunes store or the App Store, and less than 1% have reported any efficacy measurements because they don't have to. They all sort of skirt both FCC and FDA oversight. So other contemporary applications will bring in the human, but only use psychiatrists in case where a patient uses a set of trigger words, which might indicate suicidal ideation, unlawful intent, or that the patient is currently being harmed by another. As frequently is the case on teletherapy apps, indications that a user is too distressed means that they can no longer rely on auto-intimacy. And many of these apps will either boot the distressed user altogether without notice, or will notify local authorities, namely the police, putting users at risk. So that's a whole class of apps, and I'm happy to talk more about them. And some apps that are very similar include crisis lines. So I'm happy to talk about that. The last group is a series of corporations that combine the services of online talk therapy with computer-guided, computer and mobile-delivered CBT. So Joyable is another concierge digital mental health service that combines a 60-second quiz to generate an emotional profile of the user, which they claim to be complete, and then we'll give you 5-minute automated cognitive activities and human, quote unquote, coaching, again, as opposed to therapy. And so Joyable is sold not to individuals who seek mental health care, but to corporations who want to pay for it and include it in their employees' benefit packages. And the advertising is therefore targeted towards corporations, not to individuals, with the tagline, happier employees, better outcomes, where the outcomes there are fiscal, not interpersonal or emotional. So whereas DARPA's funding of Ellie, or relatedly, the development of these interventions by governments Um, are moments where teletherapy addresses overt crisis, the returning veteran, or say in the wake of a natural disaster. Joyable addresses itself to the emotional crisis that labor is, redressing it just enough that optimal labor can continue. Again, part of the choice to buy into a digital program at this level has to do with Colby's early notion of making therapy nearly costless by automating the same therapy for all at once with a single program. Joyable claims to offer us a universalizable auto intimacy. So now just to conclude with some thoughts about our contemporary algorithmic mental health care landscape. Care proceeds by constellation. It's an object, a subject, a location, a means, a practice, and a result. It is always relational, occurring between and within these coordinates. Care is always labor. Care is not just an interpersonal phenomenon. It's contained by histories of systemic violence and shaped in their current topographies and their enactments. Care can be found where other forms of care have been rescinded, where it is absent. In the English word care, one can still find echoes of its many shedded meanings. Care can be produced from a cry, a lament, a warning, take care, or be a state or an action to pay close attention, a relation to be responsible for someone or something or oneself. And it can also crucially describe an absence. You can forget your cares, or you can be the person that care forgot. Care is then this capacious term that is used to describe a set of relations that redress something that ails or needs attention, whether human or environmental. Its definitional capacity points the way to understanding care not as neutral, not as a basic moral good, but as an intervention that may license, carry, instruct, or harm in excess of its remit. Care can be another name for carelessness or harm itself. Too many contemporary modes of digital self-help and self-improvement show that enjoyability is intrinsic to intimacy with a non-human other because it's a way of being intimate with ourselves, or even or especially if that self-intimacy is mediated by a cute digital penguin. That repeating interactions are necessary for therapy and therapeutic growth, even if that appointment is only with oneself, without care of another. Caring for oneself overtly then will be phrased through pleasure, turning the work of therapy into play and game into therapeutic work, while putting the burden of care on the subject of care themselves. AI for care is as old as AI itself. As Ruha Benjamin and Danya Glabau have argued, digital health interventions often promise us transcendence for the individual, for society, for the group, that we can get beyond our own human history and its structural violences. The promise of technocare is that it may allow those excluded from traditional care to be reinfolded into systems and experiences of same. The opposite holds in reality. AI, machine learning based care interventions embed and recodify race and gender, whether in the feminization of bots that act as, in Kalindi Vora and Neda Atansky's words, surrogate humans in care scenarios, or in the deployment of algorithms that foster the conditions of medical redlining and the further flourishing of white supremacy, not just in medicine, but also in therapeutics. Where this refolding of the excluded does take place, it's often in the service of extraction, datification, capture, control, and profit. Our crisis of care is not, incidentally, that algorithms are coming or that they have come, but how algorithms for care are deployed in the service of that predictive control. The more that one will use a platform for care, the more mineable data there is at the mercy of its container. De-identification and anonymity are not static states, and consent is far from always informed. Automated care is held up as accessible. It allows us, it allows help not only to reach more patients, but also those who wouldn't be able to come to an office, whether that's patients who face racial discrimination, are rural, poor, housebound, disabled, or other groups traditionally marginalized by the care and PSI disciplines. In turn, it's these same users who are already much more vulnerable systematically to counting, data collection, prediction, and intervention by state and social services, sometimes with lethal consequence. So now, when distance is a necessary public health mandate, and there are almost no therapists in office for private practice, some come back, then they leave again. Teletherapy is no longer a shadow form. It is the dominant mode of psychological care on offer. So, given this turn, we must reevaluate once again the usefulnesses and pitfalls of teletherapy, both conducted by human, but more importantly, also by machine, and what we're willing to authorize as a crisis measure in the service of batch processing patients, knowing that what we authorize in crisis often becomes the norm on the other side. We cannot simply look at access as a moral good or the successes auto intimacy might bring, whether in compliance or in providing a moment of joy. Instead, we must focus on the total outcome of care. We cannot hope to enfold those who care forgot while repressing the central fact. Care is a tool, but it is also much too often a weapon. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all in the Q&A.
Oh, great. Yes, I am. I am here. Okay. That was so fantastic. And yeah, I have so many questions. Uh, Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. There's just so much food for thought, as there is in your book. And I just yeah, I think that the the question that you ended with seems really at the heart of the matter, especially for those of us living through the pandemic today, thinking about, I mean, you must, I don't know, maybe you could just sort of begin there as we're waiting for people to think about what kinds of questions they have and formulate what their responses are. Could you talk about what it was like to kind of write the book and then and then have the book kind of emerge into this moment that seems to make it even more relevant than than you maybe had imagined in the years that you were working on it?
Yeah, it was very strange timing. And just again, thank you so much for having me and for that question. The Distance Cure was written over, 10 years, like many first and second academic monographs, and third, maybe. It was under review and had been under review for quite some time when the pandemic hit. And it was accepted just as we went into lockdown. So the whole book was done. And at the end of the book, my editor really generously allowed me to put a coda called "When Distance is Everywhere." I always check because it's a question of whether or not I was hopeful. So is, and it still is everywhere. There's this distance, which allowed me to reflect on what it was to watch the shadow form of the book, that's like a central contention, become like the overt dominant form, which was eerie, because I was a human being living also through a pandemic, and friends were dying and family was sick. But also allowed me to think a little bit about what had been below the surface, concealed from view, that then was becoming more and more readily apparent. I think it was Alondra Nelson said early on in the pandemic, the pandemic is going to be a mirror to society. And so part of society that I was, of course, interested in tracking was the kind of extraction of so-called users in their suffering, which of course has only heightened in the pandemic. I think we all know that anecdotally, but statistically also, suffering of the psychological sort has increased for the last 2 years.
Yeah, it just seems it must have been so surreal. Yeah, just to sort of experience that and to be in the process. I mean, I think everybody who's written an academic book has that kind of moment, if you're lucky, right? Where at the end you think, oh, now I kind of know what it's about, and maybe I should rewrite it. But to have it sort of be so spectacularly attuned and sort of tethered to circumstances globally just seems yeah, like a really intense way to finish your first academic monograph.
The only other thing I can say as we wait for questions is it's really hard to remember what those first weeks and months were like. But it allowed me to feel at all useful.
Mm,
Right. I all of a sudden couldn't, it was I remember, right? It was March 13th. We're almost into the third year in terms of California. And because the apparatus of the book was there, all the research was done. Um, I allowed me to continue talking to the same people I've been talking to for nearly a decade as they started making these online clinics or trace
mm.
out the new hotlines that were launching immediately and preserve them. Because I think that was one of the things that was hard and difficult in writing the book, was that the archives were so difficult to find. And in fact, I had to make so many different kinds of archival um, documentation and made a lot of oral histories. So at least I felt like, oh, I can get to work doing this so that whatever historians are going to look at this moment, there was like a tiny part that I could at least have digital tape of. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, so first question coming in. And oh, I see it's a direct message, so I'll just read it out loud. This is from Zoe Hutchins, and she asks, "Has there been a move?" Yeah, who's a fabulous student of ours. Has there been a movement to resume in-person therapy sessions following the pandemic within the therapist community, or have they taken to teletherapy? What, in other words, yeah, what's the because there was this sort of sudden shift, how much of a shift back is there, or what, yeah, what does that sort of landscape look like, if you have a sense of it?
Yeah, so thank you. And I've spent a lot of time talking both in finishing that little coda with psychotherapists and also with cognitive behavioral therapists, art therapists, child therapists, but then also I've given a number of talks at institutes, and so I have continued to talk with psychotherapists. It's very polarized, which I knew. It's part of why I wanted to write the book in the first place, like one of the reasons. Some people say it's the worst thing that could ever happen. It will finally destroy psychology, that you cannot make a therapeutic connection on Zoom. But more frequently, many therapists went into the pandemic assuming that would be the case, and then were like excited, horrified, intrigued by the fact that it was the opposite. In fact, it was more intimate. So if we thought of Zoom as being this kind of deadening, terrible, metallic space, suddenly they were seeing the bedrooms of their patients, and their patients were seeing their fake offices, right? The setup of the corner with a Zoom screen. And patients could play really differently with using Zoom. One of my favorite examples is a therapist who was in treatment with a patient before and into the pandemic, and the patient became pregnant early in the pandemic, and the therapist never knew because the patient never brought it up until there was a baby 10 months later. Like, where, of course, if you saw a person pregnant in the office, you would know at a certain point. So there's this kind of shift to what is private, what is concealed. But instead of that being a loss, which was how many thought of it before, it became a new place to think and interpret. I do think people are much more worried about a hybrid form. When do you see your patient in the office and when do you see them at home? Is it okay if they want to just like last minute make a switch? Because this is a labor question. And so the book is very much a patient-centered history, but at the same time, it is documenting this massive shift in therapeutic labor as it's both feminized and devalued. And this is a place that a number of therapists are not just those in private practice, but those who work on like apps are really feeling that demand to be always on and very flexible, which is a kind of gigification of their work.
Mhm. You know, speaking of kind of devaluing therapy and thinking about the ways in which it gets monetized, your account of the history of CBT is alarming and surprising, given its which is cognitive behavioral therapy. given its widespread popularity, given its usefulness, I wonder if you could, I feel like your account of it was kind of a little bit of a step back from determining whether or not, evaluating it as a therapeutic method, but instead, you're talking about how it sort of functioned uh, socially, culturally, financially, structurally, et cetera. So I wonder if you ran into any tensions either with CBT or with other forms of therapy where you thought like, oh, I'm offering a kind of a critique that, I don't know, might alarm people who use these therapeutic methods, or if there was any tension, involved in kind of describing things that remain popular
Yeah.
in this way. Yeah. If you understand sort of what
Yeah,
I'm trying to get at, I
totally.
don't think that was
It was
not as
beautifully done. It
okay.
was gentle and beautifully done. Yeah, so I think this is a strange thing about being, I have kind of two trainings at once. I'm a historian of psychiatry and a historian of technology and media. Um, but because I run all the way to the present, I also do policy work and advocacy work. But, yeah, being in the history of psychiatry and the psi disciplines generally means that, of course, you're thinking about the problems of capitalism and care, even when that care helps people. And it does, right? CBT is fascinating to this project because from jump, it was designed to become automated. Again, not in the sense of like get a computer, but in the sense of like get a workbook. And it doesn't mean that Norman Vincent Peale and Smiley Blanton never helped anyone when they wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. I am sure they did. But we can also think about how that book comes to be and critique its origins and also what it might be occluding. So with CBT, that's difficult because there are people who are now maybe in this room feeling very helped by the therapy. But there are also, and I'm not a clinician. That's why I gave my two
Oh,
disciplinary
yeah, yeah, yeah.
tags.
No, yeah, I mean, we all know people, right,
Yeah.
who use these therapies
Oh,
quite successfully. Yeah.
absolutely. And so one thing I say in the book and I cite is that CBT is considered to be slightly more effective when it's delivered by a computer than a human. But that doesn't mean it's not effective. It just means that a lot of the way we think about what would be better, what would be effective is a kind of purity human based notion rather than like how can the thing be delivered. At the same time, there is one major concern around CBT, which is that it's very effective while you're in it and less so afterwards. So whereas with therapies of depth and insight, you have symptom reduction long term after the therapy concludes. Now, Beck and Ellis, their ghosts would be saying to me, if it ever concludes, but that symptom reduction remains long term. CBT, not so much. So we can think again about the history of effective cures and expedient cures for the mind, which really in the sort of contemporary and modern landscape start around World War II, how to get people to fit for battle right away. Then it was psychoanalysis. And think a little bit about why it's the most popular or the only one that insurance likes to reimburse for, or why it's so friendly to the app. But it's not a critique of everyone. Like this is the Adorno thing, right? The wrong life. Like anyone who can get some care that works for them and truly works for them, that is what matters. And then it's, those of us in the sort of mind sciences get to make these other kinds of critique. But there's a big difference between critiquing the therapeutic relationship one is in and thinking about how something comes into being and why it captures a market rather than an individual. That's
Yeah, no, I mean, I really appreciate it. I just was thinking about it sort of in relation to the critique that you offer at the end. It's like Benjamin books like that, that right, that there are structural issues with some of these therapies that go all the way down. And so it was in that vein that I was also kind of thinking about what the interaction is between things that actually help people, but that but that also have these structural elements that are deeply troubling. But Meryl, actually, I can, if you want to join us. I don't know, Meryl, if you want to join us, but if you just want me to read your Uh,
Sure, I
okay,
can.
perfect.
Happy
Yes.
to read it. Yeah, no, I was just very interested if you could talk more about your process, Hannah. Also, first of all, great talk. Um, how you came to bound the sort of the category of teletherapy across a range of different media, that vary significantly in terms of how one could or would talk about its interactivity or sort of pseudo interactivity. So, I love this book covers like letter writing and phone services and sort of more computerized versions. And so just really interested in how you came to like draw delineations between what fell into the bucket and what didn't get included. And what didn't get included, I'm also very interested in.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, the rejected case studies. They're so happy to not have been written about by me. So the way I set up the book, like if I'm speaking quite honestly, was that at first the thought was, well, there hasn't been a comprehensive history of mediated therapy. But this very quickly became the argument of the book that all therapy is mediated. So then I needed a different word. This was like in the early, like 2012. So like the word teletherapy, actually, like my phone didn't recognize it and Word didn't recognize it. And my friends and advisors didn't really recognize it. So I actually got to just think about tele, like far, and therapy, and think about, okay, if we know what the contemporary is now, which is like your therapist may be seeing you on Skype, remember Skype, the forgotten platform, or like these new emergent apps for the iPhone, which were just starting. The kind of industry of tele health generally was sort of beginning to explode. I was like, how do I trace back a history from there? And that's how I did it. So I looked up a kind of like genealogy of a technique, which is relating with patients over distance. And so I, was surprised to learn about e-therapy at Cornell in the 1980s. So it went on the list, and the early cyber mental health clinics done by, for those of us who really want to have a 90s flashback, interrelay chat and AIM and things like this, and further back and further back. Then it became a question of like, so what if it's not a licensed therapy? And it felt very important to think about what the crisis hotline did, which was kind of really, truly try and democratize while still capturing and sometimes controlling its users, depending on the line, as part of that technique that helped users or habituated users into thinking about picking up the phone for help rather than going to an office, all the way back to Freud, who very famously in that world had a self-analysis conducted via letter writing. And I read all the letters and made a very different interpretation, which is that the self-analysis is not reported in the letters. It is the letters. It's a tele-analysis via the post. And Freud did also use letter writing with his own patients, which I talk about as well. So that became the arc. What fell out? There's also a chapter on radio, which is, I think, the strangest chapter in the book. What fell out? Things like VR therapy. In part because my brilliant colleague Marissa Brandt has written so brilliantly about VR therapy, and Amit Pichevsky has written so brilliantly about VR therapy. And I felt like, okay, great. The book is already 320 pages long. Or art therapy or Rorschach tests. Again, there's really great work in these areas. And with VR therapy, the therapist is literally sitting next to you, maybe even touching you. So I could have made an argument about like an overlapping circuit of self and auto intimacy and touch, but I wanted these really kind of either therapist at some quite normative distance or so far away that they don't exist. That was how I tried to delimit it.
Wonderful. I think that fits into conversations that I have with students about like telecommunications and how how that might seem like an antiquated term and how it is everything at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, there was, maybe it's still there. I'd have to go check, but I had the Balby definition and said, so I'm using a more expansive version, right? I am going to include the radio. It's not just going to be point-to-point communication, comm training, but then I think for the book, I may have softened that.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I have another question here that is a direct message. Jay, I don't know if you want to ask it yourself or if you'd like me to ask it for you.
Yeah, sure. I can kind of ask it myself, I
Perfect.
think. Hello. Great talk, by the way. Yeah, I guess one of the interesting ideas that came up to my mind listening to this was regards to my the background of, Eastern culture of they're not as acceptive or willingness of therapy in regards of what that looks like throughout like, and I'm sure that's like applicable to a lot of different cultures out there. And I guess I want to like get your perspective on this matter of like what's the general role you found teletherapy to have, like regarding kind of these like barriers or cultures that prevent people from being willing to have or get access to therapy. And one of the examples that you brought up was like structural racism, again, that comes to my mind. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this question. So what drew me to that project, where I'm describing what I did once I was drawn to it, but the reason I was invested in teletherapy as a form of care, wanting to trace that technique, is because teletherapy in its long history is almost always for free or very low fee. It's only in our moment where teletherapy starts being synonymous with going to the therapist office, but on Zoom, and costing also $399 or whatever Eliza charged Perry. So teletherapy has been more likely a form of democratized care, which of course then can mean that the very same people who are using that form of care are going to be exploited by its capitalization, quite literally. So there's that, but also distance does things, and not just bad things. And this is the kind of argument in the book, is that we've been really trained, and I'm not an apologist for big tech, I have to say, and I'm not evangelizing for teletherapy either. Certainly not. The end of the book, which deals with that stuff, is pretty bleak, as you just saw in the talk. But that for a long time, the idea of picking up the phone and not being seen while you ask for care or ask for help, and no one being able to see you do it, has been really important for many communities. So the suicide hotline that I write about, the very first in the US, was a queer-led and operated suicide hotline in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco in the 1950s, when the Diagnostic Statistic Manual still had quote unquote homosexuality as a disorder. And it was also the era of the Lavender Scare. And so police were raiding all of the queer spaces in San Francisco quite routinely. And no one was going to go to a psychiatrist's office in this community. They just weren't going to do it. So the idea of being able to go somewhere without going somewhere, to get care without being seen, was crucial. It's why I wanted to include the hotline. And we see this still now with apps on the iPhone, where it's, again, people who would rather receive care without anyone knowing about it, and that they can perhaps purchase, right? Therapy is excruciatingly expensive, even for people who manage to undertake it. That was really important. Unfortunately, this also means that it's these same apps that have the most dense and unreadable terms of service that will sell your data, that will, partner with state services, that will do all this. So that's always the trade-off in our contemporary. For a long time, that wasn't the case. But in the last 10 years or so, it's become more and more, unfortunately. But that was one of the sort of guiding questions of this book, and I really appreciate you asking.
Yeah, I volunteered for, I'm probably like many people who were in college in the 90s and early 2000s, I volunteered for a hotline, and yeah, remember that feeling of, being able to help. It was a domestic violence hotline, and being able to help people who can't leave their homes. So crucial. But yeah, it would be interesting to know what the demographic breakdowns of people using those hotlines, what those hotlines is. Lori has a question.
I thought that was absolutely mesmerizing. Thank you. And I just learned a lot. My brain was going 100 directions, but I wanted to ask about this democratization that you're describing, and the marketing of teletherapies, and the variety of credentials and absence of credentials among people who are interacting with people who are potentially genuinely vulnerable, and vulnerable to harms and also varieties of exploitation. And if one of the, I guess I'm looking for you to speak to the boundary between all of these legitimized therapeutic forms and, for lack of a better word, cults of self-help that where they're marketing, 10 years of growth in 18 months of, tight-knit communities, deep work of self, and very attractive gurus with, real or pretend PhDs who, for who a mere $10,000 you can, and on and on. And this is not an incidental phenomenon. It's real, it's big, and often the people most attracted to it are, very smart young people who are desperate.
Yeah. So I think there are two parts to this question. One, which is, the sort of on the cult end of things. I don't really address this in the book, but actually I'm writing a little bit about this now, in my second book. And yeah, I mean, it relies on a lot of the same kinds of marketing that non-cult, but very bad for us, I think I can say that, teletherapy sort of corporate work is doing. Like my favorite one to talk about is there's a teletherapy app that sells itself as therapy for all. Right, this kind of democratization, when the therapy app charges you the same it would cost for you to see a therapist outside the app, and also pays its workers like $15 an hour. And so there's all this sleight of hand about what therapy for all might mean. They inflate their numbers, they've lied in their studies. All of this is well documented, like in the New York Times. So, right. And then but we don't call that a cult, right? We don't call that anything, that we just call that a corporation doing what corporations do. And then these, of course, very vulnerable people are attracted to anything that might ameliorate human loneliness and alienation. I think we all are. The sort of question is about vulnerability, what we've decided is credulity or gullibility. And I'll remember, I have a little essay coming out on that question I will send to you when it comes out in the next few weeks. And I think it's those things we have to really think about, right? Which is the sort of epidemic of loneliness, which is not like because of the telephone, right? But because I would argue late stage capitalism really has done a number on human relations. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of play actually between the two parts of the question, which is really sad, but is the case.
Yeah, so I have maybe a less grim question, but maybe equally grim. I don't know. But
grim questions, it's okay.
Yeah. So I've been in one of the classes that I teach. A colleague who works on digital health technologies is talking about how many of them, as you sort of alluded to as well, are licensed under entertainment rather than being licensed under healthcare, and that allows them to avoid and evade all kinds of, as you said, right, FDA regulations, other kinds of regulations. I don't know if, I was just wondering if you might be able, I mean, in his reporting, he said, he works on, just to flesh out the picture, he works on home healthcare apps, right? So like, what is your Apple Watch? Like, what is all the stuff on the Apple Watch actually doing? It's actually entertainment, right? It's not making claims for healthcare. And in his discussion of it, one thing that he pointed out was the kind of limitations for care that then provides, right? So, and I'm just thinking of this because we were talking about it in one of my classes this morning, that you're is off about your heart rate, like, or your blood pressure or something like that, but it's not going to call the ambulance for you, because then it would be healthcare. And so it just is, I just am sort of wondering if you could talk more about kind of some of the legal limitations and whether you see this. I mean, I think part of his lament was that because of liability, people aren't going to aren't going to register these as healthcare, but that also means that then they're not being used as healthcare. And if you maybe you have a different perspective on this question of liability and licensing under entertainment versus healthcare.
Yeah, and I think this is also part of Lori's question too, right? Oh, there's so much to say here. So one thing I was really surprised by in writing the book was that suicide is it shouldn't be surprising. It was my own naivete. But suicide is the litmus and liability test for all tele stuff in the mental health care world. So it's all about shirking that liability or over responding to it. So that's everything from why many hotlines partner with the police, is to protect and indemnify the hotline, even if the police end up murdering the person they're responding to, which happens about 12 times a year, every single year in the United States. Yeah, really. And I can share a little essay I've written about that, and a little bit is in the book. On the one hand, to like the whole very strange, kind of boring to many people, but fascinating to me world of interstate licensure. So we live in the US, where if you are a therapist in California, you cannot practice in New York. There are some states that have reciprocal licensing, mostly not. So there are all of these questions then about like, do the patient and therapist have to be in the same state as the corporation? As you know, these kinds of questions, again, always centered around this worst case scenario, which would privilege the in-person scenario as somehow like the clinician would know better what was happening with the patient. So there's always this fundamental assumption that in person we're going to know more, which I'm really trying to undermine in the book. Not that it's never the case, of course, sometimes it is, but that it has shaped so much of this policy. That looks very different when these apps are like, here, can you swipe like this and do 5 minutes of a worksheet, when they're never going to get that data. That's not the data they're interested in. Unlike your colleague who's still picking up all this bio data, but it's in an entertainment app and they're not going to call the ambulance. In mental health care, it's like quite the opposite. They're like much more likely to deploy state services, or really not be looking at any therapeutic data at all. Like not even the sham version. Like really, then it would be like talking to your replica, an avatar that looks like you, which is weird. Self-therapy. That's the true auto intimacy.
Oh my God, I didn't know.
I had it off the screen for a second.
I see. Yeah, I wasn't 100. I think I was taking notes and I must have missed that that's what that was.
I didn't say you can customize it to look like yourself. That's the whole point of it. And in fact, it emerged, the person who created it is out here in the Bay Area. She made a neural net based off of a beloved friend who had died. And so she brought back her friend to life on this neural net using all of his text messages. Long before this kind of other famous case happened last year in San Francisco. And so that raises all these questions also about like, what are the psychical states being inflected and impacted upon via using these human conduits, but also it's generating its data and using its machine learning towards the therapeutic mental health friend as well. So sometimes those projects are working in concert. I'd love to hear about your colleagues' work, though.
No, it reminds me, this is probably not what it's supposed to remind me of, but like, because I'm mostly study the 19th century, of all these like weird beliefs that people had about technology in the 19th century, that somehow you could use, like spirit rapping, right? That you can use Morse code to talk to, that Morse code would allow you to talk to your dead relatives, or things like that.
Thought so. Freud was, my favorite, like weird in the book is that like Freud had seances in his apartment. He was totally out there, and not just interested in, and that's actually, maybe it's like a fun, uplifting joke. Most people, when they say the title of my book, they say The Distance Cure: History of Telepathy. And there's like this amazing parapraxis, which is, I think, actually really the case, that this, what you're gesturing at, the 19th century idea of kind of spirit medium communication, is also part of why people are tantalized by teletherapy, as well as really fear it. And that was very strange. Again and again, it comes up. So on the one hand, there's a kind of medical legal understandings of what we're doing when we do that therapy. And then there's this whole other sort of soupy spiritual idea of kind of meeting out there on this
Yeah.
other plane that also keeps coming up right alongside, very, very much in your period.
Yeah, and this is my first job was in Florida, and you might know that there's it's still extant and practicing spiritualist community in Florida. Oh yeah, and you can go and they have doors on the second floor of the house and stuff like that to let in the spirits. Yeah, should you ever find yourself near Orlando, you can but this is just mesmerizing, and I have a million other questions, but I also see that we have 1 minute left. So to be respectful of everyone's time, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was just fantastic, and I feel like I'm going to go back and probably rewatch it just to sort of soak in everything that you had to say. But I hope we can just all thank you for joining us today for this really, really exciting talk, and one that I think just touches on so many things, not just academic that I know a lot of the students on the call are interested in, but also just that touch all of us, especially living in this world. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so nice to get to speak with you.